We saw in the earlier lecture that the letters of Sanskrit were so arranged that they were not just letters for speaking, but were actually a way of organizing the whole of the universe. And so they became the framework for a cosmology, not unlike the way that that bird-like shape, based on the letter A in the Slavic tradition, also worked as a framework for the whole of the Slavic alphabets. One of the reasons for linking the letters of Sanskrit with the chakras was that there was a theory that everything starts at the Muladhara, at the bottom. And there are three stages of silent noises, pardon the seeming contradiction, but silent sounds called sabda, before you actually get to something that's audible. And so you link the chakras with the sounds, and then the part that we're used to, namely from the throat to the mouth, is simply the final stage of a much more complicated process. And this whole alignment of the body with the sounds and with the letters is important because it means that the letters then are not just the sounds to start creation, but in fact are also the sounds that make life but keep us alive as we live and breathe. And so breathing, or prana as it's called, becomes an essential part of the early alphabets. If we go to Taoism, you will notice that, of course, there are the kinds of diagrams that we have for the tourists and so on that make it all look, well, the Americans would say sexy. But if you look at the abstract versions of this, we now see that the 5 elements are linked as abstract points in an almost geometrical form. And this is the equivalent of your first 5 Mahabhutas. And here are 2 versions of the abstract thing. And of course, you can translate that into an abstract geometry that starts with the Tai and then goes to yin-yang, and then great yin and great yang, and then finally the 8 that becomes the basis then of the kinds of symbols that we use when we do the I Ching, the 64, the yin and the yang ones. Well, this is all then starting to come together. So the sounds, so this shape that looks like a spider is on the one hand a shape, on the other hand it's a sound. This, the tor, is on the one hand a mudra, but on the other hand it's something you do while in a breathing process, which you will see if you go and watch yogis doing their exercises, and especially in China, where the bodily movements and the breathing movements are essentially linked. And here, this shape that we've seen the history of, you see he's actually doing a yoga position, and we get an abstract form, we get the letter form, and then we get the this kind of symbol form. That same form comes as one of the numbers in Turkish. And in fact, in Turkish, you see that we have 1, we have an L, we have this, then we turn it around, then we have this shape. And so the numbers and the letters are all related. Now, in the alphabet that I showed you from Bulgaria, well, it started as Scytho-Sarmatian, you will recall, and then that became Old Bulgarian. And remember, I said there were 3 X's? Well, there are the 3 X's. So 49, 50, and 51. Now, if you take that first one, in one of the alphabets, that was the letter A. Now, these same shapes, so this shape is like the letter psi in Greek. And here you see these three shapes, well, this one upside down, then this one upside down, and this one. This one is called man in the ruins. And then if you take, so this is letters 1, 5, and 7. If you do the next series, you get these three letters. And if you now, so their values is 1, 5, 7. Their value is 30, 50, 70. If I now take those and do the mirror, I get these shapes. And you will see, if this is a man, well, you can see that this is like the phi symbol. And so we showed how the symbols, by tearing them apart and doing a quarter, you get a letter. Now we see if you start taking a single letter and making a double, you start to go back to a symbol. And this gets extremely interesting because in the mystical tradition of the northern countries, the letters become ways of making symbols. So the most simple one is using a Y, an X, and a psi, and that is then a human being. Or you use an F going up, which we saw in the magical alphabet of the moon for the first time, and is the letter Fehu. Then one going down, so it's like a downward F, and then X marks the spot for what the Italians call the sacra, but you would call the muladhara. And then you can have, you can make a rune man of various runes. And if you look very closely, you'll see that the central rune is again our stick. Remember we had the stick and the X? And then there's one going to the, down to the right, and the other one is going down to the left. And so this whole thing becomes a way of using runes to make a man again. And you can do this to link up with the planets. You can do this to link up with the 7 major disciplines, so Theosophia, Kabbalah, Hyperphysica, Physio-Agraria, Physicochemia, Physicomedicina, and Physica. And so we have symbols that become letters, and then letters which, when combined, mystically become symbols again. And the situation gets more complicated because then we have something called the magic square, which starts in India as far as we know, though it's used equally in China, and then it came via the Arabs in the 9th century to Europe. The simplest square goes like this. It has 9 squares, and it goes 1, 2, 3, then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now, if I join all the lines, I get this shape. And if I take away the 2 extremities, I get this shape, which is the letter HH in some of the earliest alphabets. And of course, if I just do 1 half of that, I have the letter A. So, aha is not just an, well, in German, it's the Aha-Erlebnis, or the aha experience. But in fact, it's taking this as a grid to create first an ah, and then aha, and have, now, in the Indian tradition, this gets this basic magic square gets linked with Kurma, the first avatar of Mr. Vishnu. Or God Vishnu, I beg your pardon. Here is a primitive drawing of this. Now in China, this gets drawn more carefully, and he becomes the world turtle. And then you see that the 8 trigrams that we are used to, they come at the 8 points of the compass, and you get that. Now this then gets linked with the elements, which we won't go into at this point, but just to know that that also happens. And then you can use this. So this is using those 9 points to create either a Hebrew or an Arabic alphabet. Now, this gets very interesting because if I'm using English, if I'm using Arabic, this is the blown up Arabic, and this is a blown up Hebrew one. So what sounds do I have for letters 1, 5, and 9? I have ah, ha, tha. Now this gets interesting because remember those magic figures of the from the mystical tradition of the man standing, and he has a ha on one side and the tha on the other. And sun and moon, right triangle, right swastika and a left swastika. So this on the one hand is 3 letters. On the other hand, it's linking with sun and moon. And on the other hand, it's ha, ha, ha. So it's think of this as the Shushumna, and then you have the 2 others on both sides. So this is a kind of geometrical model of the human body. And you can do the same in Hebrew. So then it's Aleph, Heth, Teth. And you can do it in English, and then it's A, E, I. And now it's only vowels in the center. And here it looks, this is what it looks like if you do it with the runes. Now remember what we said about doubling them? So if you double them, the phi is actually right in the center, and it's like as your son would say, it's at the bottom, it's at the middle of my heart this time, rather than or at the, and so on. So this becomes a model for how we organize sounds. And then to create more complicated sounds, we add a second square, and then you get 20 letters. And if you add another 2, then you get 10. And of course, normally in these early alphabets, the 10th letter is a Y. Now, if I simply join the 3 points, then the Y makes out of this a 3-fold division of the world. And so there's a very curious way in which the sounds organize the space, and the space organizes the sounds to create the basics of a cosmos. That we'll go back to in lectures 12 and 13. Well, in Sanskrit, one of the most important sounds is linked with one of the most important birds, the Hamza. But it is a, ham, aha, sa, or a-m-s. Well, aleph, mim, shin is the Hebrew. And I can link those. Well, here you see it in an early mystical diagram. I showed you that the various chakras were linked by the Mandaics, and that they linked that with the 10 so-called parts of the body in the creation story. Well, here is A, there's M, and there's S. And this is linked with something that we think of as the Ankh, and here is Ama, and here is Umu. So mother and father. And so you can write, and you can also make this into a name, Sam. Going this way, Sam. And then you can write Sam this way, or this way, and you can do the same with Yahweh. Because if you go back to the A is Aleph, but it is also the letter V, so 6, the letter Yod, which is 10, so 16, plus another 6, so you get 21, or it can also end up as 26. So, but this then also becomes a symbol of the lungs. And so you have the first letter, which on the one hand breaks down into 3 letters or 4 letters, it can have different numerical values, but symbolically it becomes a picture of the lungs for breathing, and as in the name of this chapter. And then there's various versions of that. And then if you go to some of the Middle Eastern Asian languages, you have in Armenian and Georgian, you have a word called jani. Well, I need not tell a Sanskrit expert that jan is birth, and so jani is life. And of course we have January is where life splits into two, and so on. So this symbol for jani and this symbol for A are both linked with life and breathing. And so to say, oh yes, I'm going to have a chapter on breathing, it sounds as if, it has nothing to do with the alphabet, but in fact, as you're starting to see, it has everything to do with the alphabet. And then the ninth letter is the theta, or the th, and that is really, well, it's also the symbol of the moon, and it is then, it's where the whole first magic square comes together. And then it can be a crisscross within the top square, but it can also be an X marks the spot for the whole of the square. And so again, the letter making makes the geometry, and the geometry makes the letters. Now, if we go to Egypt, we see that exactly the same principle happens. Well, first, before going to Egypt, let's start in India again. Here we see a triangle, a downward triangle. They combine and they make the figure of the sun, S-O-N. Here you see the same symbols in an Egyptian papyrus, and then downward triangles like this have letters at each point. Upward ones have it there. And so then these become, this is 18, 19, 20. If you go to section 20, you're here, or 19, you're here. So the 100, that is the beginning of life, is there. And Sirius, the sh sound, is the star Sirius in the sky. And here it is there, again, in the Egyptian hieroglyphs in the Mimshim alphabet. So the letters that are for breathing are not just for breathing in the human body, but link up then also with the whole of cosmology. So here we see a triangle, an upward triangle, a lower triangle, and then combined. And so this is the father, the mother, leading to the sun in the Hindu tradition. In the Egyptian mystical tradition, these triangles recur. So we have an upward triangle, a downward triangle, and then one where the two combine. And below you see downward triangles, each linked with 3 points, linking with 3 letters, and above then upward triangles. And so this making of simple geometrical shapes becomes a way of making individual letters. For example, this is letter 18, 19, 20. And if you look in an Egyptian zodiac, 19, the bridge between 19 and 20 comes just at the height of summer, and is, remember, in terms of the geometry, or sorry, the number symbolism is 100. So 19 is the number of 100 and of life, and is also the number for Eve, the mother of all life. And here, in terms of the star zodiac, and the stars that are connected, we see that at 19 we have the star Sirius, which is the brightest star in the south, and it's a 5-pointed star, which we see again in the Mimshim alphabet. Now, another way of looking at this is the human body. So the human body, we have the Sushumna, wrapping around it are Ida and Pingala, the male and the female, or the female and the male in that order. But And in the West, that becomes 3 columns. The central column is the A, then the M, and then the S. And so AMS or SAM, depending on the way you read it. Now, this gets quite interesting in the, both in Hebrew and Arabic, 2 of the most important letters are Ain and Chain. And if you ask the average Hebrew or the average Arabic, where did they come from? They'll just say, they're Hebrew letters. Stop bothering me. Get off my case. However, if we go back to Sanskrit, we see these 2 letters, E and I, so a vowel and a semivowel, yes? And then if you look at Urdu, we have Ain and Chain, and what are they? These are the Sanskrit letters, with a little bit of extras added on. And so they go through various variations as we go westwards. And where do we end up? We end up with that funny sign that we linked up with Hun from China, and that becomes one of the most important letters of Mimshim. And then in the other Egyptian alphabets, it becomes this kind of wormy thing that looks like a Shushumna again, or almost like the Caduceus of Mercury. And so this is, for me, a beautiful example of, if I only know Arabic or only know Hebrew, I have my own wild theories. But when you start to look across the alphabets, then you see that in one alphabet this becomes a geometrical man with his hands up, as we saw when we're going through customs, and which we saw in the old Russian alphabet. And then in other ones it becomes a snake, and in another one it becomes that, and another one becomes that, and then ends up with these, well, it ends up like this in early Hebrew, and then here are some of the variants. Now, if we turn to China, the key letter for the beginning of life is fire. And if you look at the fire image, what is it? Well, it's 2 strokes because it's man, yes, but then 2 bits with it. And does that not remind you of the A with its 2 strokes? And so the context changed slightly, but the principle of letter making as a way of combining bits of pieces to create a new symbol is the same whether we're using Chinese or Hebrew. And then what you do with those 3 symbols, or with the number of symbols, varies. You can create a Caduceus-like Ida Pingala Shushumna in the Indian tradition. You can make it into a snake embodying a body, such as here in the Western tradition. You can make these 3 AMS into letters, writing, and numbers. You can make them into normal letters, or you can make them into symbols. And a good Hebrew will realize that all 3 are connected. So now you can start to look at letter making in the body and letter making in the cosmos as one and the same thing. So you can take Kala Chakra and align that. You can put a so-called Jed, which is the central pillar in the Egyptian tradition, and put an Ankh on the top and put a sun on top of that. You can have the Chinese tradition, and this is then where the Yang symbol is. Or we can start with our squares, our imaginary 9 squares, yes, and we have AHTH, KSPH, and then 2 final ones. And so this becomes then not only a central square, but it becomes, by the time we get to 15, we have, in fact, a mini pinnacle, which is again the letter Samek. So the letter Samek is the completion, almost the midpoint of the completion of the alphabet, and it's the midpoint and completion of the creation of man. and it's the first of the two. If I take the K, now if I imagine that to be the square, if I take the K and do it to one side, I get this. If I do that, if I double it, I get that. And I am back at my 6-pointed star that becomes the flower of life. And if I join the points, I have a cube again. And so the letters become cubes, become symbols, and become the ways of speaking, but at the same time go backwards. And the Y is similar. And so all of these things come together. I can take 10 points in the body and say these are 10 points of creation. So I start with 1 point, then 2 and get a line, 3 points and I get a triangle, and then 4 points and I get a pyramid. If I put them together like that, these are 10 stages of creation. If I put them like this, they are the positions of the planets, and they're the symbols of the story kitchen. If I put them like this and make this hexagram inside, then this is Oas, which we just saw in the mystical tradition of the Egyptians. And if I take the triangle and put numbers to it, I have the numbers for the annual lunar cycle, and we are now at Purnima. And this Ankh symbol, here you see the Egyptian gods are actually baptizing the man with ankhs. And of course the Christian version is you baptize him like this. Notice that this is in the pre-Christian tradition that they get this from the Aryans in Ravenna. He is up to half in water, so he's exactly the bottom half. The lower 7 chakras are water and washed, whereas the top 7 chakras, so when a good Hindu sits down, instead of being in water, they are simply hidden from view, and you deal with it that way. And here is an early sign thing. So this is Capricorn, and then which is A, and B and C are ankhs, and C is then the symbol for Capricorn. Well, the ankh has a tremendous amount of variance, including little human beings. So the ankh becomes, on the one hand, a symbol that we use to talk about life and eternity and infinity. On the other hand, it becomes something that you give to people. So here the goddess gives life in the form of an ankh, and here the king does the same. And then here the king has 2, one for probably the heart and one for the soul. And here the goddess is giving one to another goddess. And here, this symbol, the yin-yang, which we saw also is connected with the god Ra, becomes the letter Theta, as in fetus. And this symbol, which is Yara, from which we get year, becomes one of the letters of that early religion, Yudzism, that I was telling you about. And so we then have a variety of ways of dealing with chakras. One is to deal only with the upper, another to deal with the whole body as a chakra. So you have 7 above and 7 below. And they can become energy spirals like this, or as in this form, which we'll see in a moment. We can do it in terms of colors like this. We can reduce it to a rune like this, so it becomes a chakra rune. We can do it to this version, or we can do it to this version, and this is called an Yggdrasil rune. Yggdrasil is another name for the world tree again. And you will remember that if I do 4 of those world trees, then I have the symbol for Mari, or the god Tengri. And if I take away the extras there, then it is an Algiz rune. And if I take away the middle point, I have the letter Y. So I can go from a single letter, and if you ask why, well, then I can say because if I put it together again, I have the whole world, all in one symbol. This is the Tibetan version. And the Tibetan version is particularly interesting because you have 8 directions. And then you have 3 kinds. So you have body, speech, and consciousness. This is a variant on the Kaya Vakchita, or body, mind, spirit. Now you have 8. You multiply by 3, 24. And you multiply that times 3 for Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna, and you have 72. So you have 72 nadis, and they apply in 1,000 different ways, so you have 72,000 nadis in the human body. All from this very simple principle. So we can do this in various ways. You can take 3 points. You can take the AMS and do Hamza. You can then start to make the Kama, Kala, and so on. That way, you can arrange them as flowers, which people do. Or you can link these now with various gods and goddesses. So the goddess Sarasvati is one of the main goddesses for the alphabet. In the male chauvinist version is Shiva, but there's also the goddess Vak. And so here you have one god on a Thai god on a peacock. Here you have Brahma on a peacock, and here you have Sarasvati on a peacock. And so Sarasvati is then a bird, a goddess, the bird is actually her seat, or on which she rides. Now, when we go to Russia, the same basic principles apply, but the Russians always have a twist on everything, for better or for worse. So they have the chakras, but then they have 2 chakras here. And they arrange that in different ways. So this is one of the ways, so that it looks like a vase. And these become then the 3 worlds. And these are different ways of drawing that, and that whole thing then becomes an Ankh in disguise. And here's another version, and there's yet another version. And so you get various forms of this man, and those then link up again with the 10 stages of creation. You have a man that looks like I'm Tarzan or I'm Atlas. That links up with the primitive form of the alphabet, and it links up with this shape, which we saw is 4 trishulas in the 4 directions. And then here you have a standing version, here you have a seating version. And then there is a version that looks like a figure 8, and the figure 8 then becomes a way of aligning all the 22 letters, and each of these has a symbolic form. There's the F one again. You have the letter form, or the written form, Fehu, and then you have its numerical value. And so, as a whole, it's a symbol of infinity, but it's an infinity that's also your letter La, if you go to some of the northern versions of Sanskrit. And this whole thing then links up with geometries again, and links up with sounds and complicated things. We could easily spend an hour on this. I'm not going to do it at this point, but you see the principle. And the standing man then gets a seated version. So basically, the circumcision of the Hebrews is not just about cutting off a little bit of the linga, but in fact, it's also cutting off the whole bottom section, which, if you align the god or the man with the cosmos, is actually the god's the star Sirius, and so you're cutting off right at the time of the solstice. And so it is not just something that you do when you're circumcised. There is a cosmic significance to that whole thing. And so then you create yin, yang, and spirit, and you get those 10 points now aligned to the upper part of the body. And that upper part of the body can then be arranged and rearranged in numerous forms. I'm just showing you some of the basic variants. And then, fascinatingly enough, you can take this and make a 9-pointed circle, so a nonogram. And we were talking about the Navaratri and all the things with 9. And now these 9 letters that we could arrange as a square can now be arranged as a circle. And it can then also be arranged as a snake that eats its tail, and the 10th letter is the eye or the central column. Or it can be a central column with a swastika there, and then the pentagon here, the hexagon there. And so again, the letter making comes from symbol making, and then combined makes new symbols. So standing back, or rather sitting back, you can see that these 10 points of the body, which are aligned with the chakras, are in a way a means of geometricizing the body, but they are called then the 10 Sephiroth and become the 10 points for creating the whole of the universe. And there are various variants on this thing. So we have the sitting version and we have the standing version. So the standing version gives me a so-called Leonardo man or a Vitruvian man. Or if I do it this way, well, this is also one of the ways of praying in the Christian tradition. But here it's the god Thor, and he's now becomes the symbol man for all of the letters of the alphabet. Now, if I take the North Indian, if I recall correctly, pattern for creating horoscopes, right? We get this. And if I abstract that and take away the names, I get this shape, which is one of the early runes. And then I get variants like this. I can take our Vitruvian man and do variants, or I can do a Vitruvian girl and get that, and I have a letter of the Turkish alphabet, which again looks rather close to the Tengri, the symbol for the Tengri. And if I abstract this, I get basically a pillar with a square at a diagonal shape, and here are 2 versions of that. And these again are 2 letters of the runic alphabet. And so if I go to the South Indian version of the horoscope, I have this. So the 4 sacred letters, and then the 12 zodiac signs. Now, if I simply join the 4 points, I have an X. And if I join various points, I end up back at the at the North Indian version. And these are all letters of the runic alphabet. And then there is a fancy version of the runic alphabet, which gives me all of this, which has a letter version, so I can read it out. It has the symbol version, this is the simple symbol version, and this is the deluxe symbol version. And so the chalice or the cup becomes this quite complicated thing, but at a simple level, this then just becomes 2 spheres, 2 spears intersecting. And they can come in different forms, and each of these are again letters. Or in more complicated versions, they become this. So again, this extraordinary way in which the symbols become letters, the letters become symbols. But symbols that combine ontologies. So one of the images that gets used is that I have a spear, and the spear is it's the letter I. And of course, in the allegorical sense, I use my spear, it's called the Vel in the Vedas, yes, and Kartikeya or Kartikai or Murugan uses the Vel to cut through the Ichna, the Jnana, so the will and the ego, and so he's killing these things. It sounds like a terrorist act, but he's actually killing the mortal aspects of himself so that he can rise to true immortality. So the Vel or the spear becomes a fundamental symbol of enlightenment. And in almost all the traditions, well, in the Western tradition, we hear of a great king called King Arthur. And he is running along, and suddenly he finds a spear caught in a stone. And only an enlightened king can take it out. Well, I thought that was, I learned as a boy that, that's King Arthur and the knights and Lancelot and all of that. And you can't get any more British than that, thank you very much. However, if you go to Italy, just outside of Siena, you will find a little church which has a spear in a stone, which links up with a story at Mount Galgano, which is on the so-called Apollo line, Apollo St. George line, linking a stone in Ireland to Armageddon on Mount Carmel. And if you look further into the history, you learn that this story goes back to the Scythians in Middle Asia. And the Russians also have their stone, and that early religion that I told you about has such a spear linked with the 9 points of a nonogram, or as it's called in Greek, an enneagram. And here is the god Perun, who has such a spear again, which is sometimes in the stone, sometimes out. Here is a drawing of it in a stone, and in the summertime, they use a pile of hay and have it symbolically in the pile of hay. And so here is again, a spear is the letter I, and yet here we have it in all the great cultures of the Western world. Well, the Western and Eastern world, in fact. So you start to see an extraordinary set of connections between the cultures. In the East, you have two twins, and they are drawn as two horses, as I recall. And they are linked with the beginning of the year. So they are really they're the Aswin twins. And then you have Taurus, the bull, who is linked with Aleph and the ox, and then Leo. And so each of the periods of the year gets linked with an animal, and that animal is also then linked with letters. And we saw that also with the Sanskrit, so that all aligns. And then there you have, well, in the West we only have 7 planets, but in the East you have 9 planets, because you have Rahu and Ketu. And they are sometimes drawn symbolically, but sometimes they are drawn as 2 dragons fighting each other. And in Middle Asia, you see these 2 dragons fighting. Here we are in Tashkent, and they are 2 dragons fighting each other. So it's another form of the mystic knot, but it's now 2 dragons really having it out. Here we see the same thing, but now on the walls of the 15th century University of Milan, which used to be the Hospital of Milan. If you go to a Christian church, you will find this. So now he's got 2 beasts trying to fight each other. And if you went to the old gate of Iraq before the Americans destroyed it in their trying to make it free, quote unquote, you would see a man fighting two dragons. Now this becomes very interesting because if we go back to the Egyptian calendar of the skies, of the stars, what do we see for the month of October? We see a man fighting, holding two dragons or two snakes. And of course, that then becomes gentrified. And instead of two snakes, we see a man with a balance, yes? But in the more popular tradition, you see basically a pillar and two arms or two snakes following it. And in the Christian tradition, you have a bishop who has something called a mitre, or a stick, a staff. And that staff has, what on it? Two snakes that are called pataritsa in Greek and also in the Orthodox Church. So I've had the pataritsa of the Bishop of Smolensk in my hands. And of course, if you think of alphabets, that's the letter Fa, which then becomes this letter and becomes this letter in that Hebrew alphabet of the Essenes of Mount of Qumran, of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So again, an extraordinary thing, because Fa is not just Fa, it is a balanced thing, and of course it's the final of the three letters of A, El, Fa. It's the beginning of the real alphabet. And so we see that this funny little letter, which is letter 22 of Sanskrit and letter 22 of Hebrew in this strange version that most people don't know, is linked with a tremendous cosmology that gets us to Rahu and Ketu and is all so connected with breath that we could end up breathless. To get back to the cosmology part, because we were getting caught up in that little letter, if I do the descent from the heavens downwards like this, I have a rune called Shila, and then I can make that in terms of a series of descents like this. I can link that to a star of Vishnu and link this with the planets. Or I can make it like this and it becomes the lightning steps. And of course, these are the same 10 steps that I do for the Zephyroth and creation. Or I can do it using a sword. So I can go from the cosmos to a stick to my letter in. Or I can see this in terms of the three columns and then the three columns within a person. Or I can go back to Ida, Sushumna, Pingala. I can make a hexagram with a snake now taking the steps. I can use the snake to emphasize where the sequence of the letters goes. Here's another version of that. Here is an abstracted version. Here is a super duper version, which if we blew it up, I could spend a couple hours on that. And then here is a Christianized version where we now have Adam and Eve holding a column along which is a caduceus, which is just a Christian way of dealing with Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna. And here is a Freemason variant on the same thing. And so again, the symbols cross the cultures and then end up becoming stories of their own. And how that goes further, we'll see in the next lectures. In the next one, we'll go back to the Russians and show how movement, so now not the movement of air in the body, but the movement of the hands and the body becomes a framework for understanding letter making.